Welcome. This is biodiversity and climate change and how they affect each other. Let's start with a definition of biodiversity. Biodiversity is simply the variety of all biotic factors on Earth, including ecosystems and genus, fauna, species. This term engulfs everything from animals to fungi to genes that compound our genotype to even the ecosystems that we all form together. It's also the result of 4 billion years of evolution through natural processes. We've been studying that life started around 3.8 billion years ago. And since then, we've always had biodiversity, sometimes more, sometimes less, but it's a very important concept to have. Three levels of diversity are comprehended between biologists: species, genetic, and ecosystem diversity. However, these levels cannot be separated. They're not independent from each other. If you change one, all the others change with it. Now that we know what biodiversity is, it's important to know why is it important for the biosphere. Biodiversity grants balance and equilibrium to the biosphere, which understands all life on Earth. It is important for each of the biological beings here to comply with their role inside an ecosystem. If the balance is obtained there through the processes we studied in class, this balance can benefit each and every one of us, except for the ones that are unfit for their environments. Biodiversity not only gets equilibrium but helps regulate environmental change, climate change, natural climate change, except for the times that it's inevitable. For us humans, having biodiversity in animals, in plants, in fungi can help us economically, either in the gastronomical sense by giving us more options to eat and exploit for consumption, or in other areas like commodities and construction, giving us new woods, new kinds of fur and textiles to use, etc. Another importance that can be found is on a theoretical level. The more biodiversity there is, the easier it is to study evolution, since you can check how genes evolved differently since each one of the species you're talking about. It's important. Biodiversity has been suffering a great loss in recent years, at least since the beginning of industrialization in the world. An example of this is that between 70 and 90% of all coral reefs are declining at sea. This is mostly because of the acidity levels increasing on the oceans. Most experts agree that climate change and human release of greenhouse gases such as water vapor and CO2 are the main reasons for it. The range of marine species have shifted to higher altitudes to avoid certain higher temperatures, such as 1 degree, 2 degrees in marine ecosystems. Alpine species are also suffering this kind of shifts, moving upwards the mountains they live in. Alpine species such as bears and foxes and certain birds are suffering the consequences of our actions. 6% of insects, 4% of vertebrates, and 8% of plants have adapted more slowly to their ecosystem, mostly because it keeps changing so fast. We have elevated the temperature, the average temperature of Earth by 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is a change that can be obtained in at least 500 years. This decline in biodiversity may lead to inbreeding between animals since the gene pool is reduced by the elimination of certain species. This may cause deformities and the appearances of negative traits may increase. The last section didn't have much to do with biodiversity, had more to do with this next topic, climate change. What is climate change? Climate change is defined to changes to a specific place climate over time. Weather and climate are different. Climate is the defined conditions of a certain ecosystem throughout the year, while weather is just the direct result of this climate variation among certain specific times. Climate change usually occurs naturally and has occurred for as long as scientists have investigated Earth climate. Things like mass extinctions, the ice ages, the Cambrian explosion, those things were considered climate changes. When oxygen started racing, when CO2 started racing, those were naturally made climate changes. However, when people in the news speak about climate change, they are talking about man-made climate change, which comes from the release of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere and the overexploitation of Earth's resources by humans. 95% of all climate change that exists today is caused by human. Experts agree on this. And humans are accelerating the process of climate change to an exponential rate. And like we mentioned before, raising the temperature, the average temperature of Earth by 1 degree Celsius, which is a change that occurs between 500 and 300 years. To know the meaning of climate change, let's see what's causing the recent climate change that's not natural. According to NASA, scientists attribute the global warming trend observed since the mid-20th century to the human expansion of the greenhouse effect. This is the release of greenhouse gases by humans to the atmosphere, so it incorporates and causes warming. Burning fossil fuels, uncontrolled deforestation, extreme mining without concern, pollution of water, and the hunting of certain species and overexploitation of certain species that either are photosynthetic or act as decomposers are part of the human activities that are contributing to the rapid increase of climate change. Despite being a politicized topic, it is a fact that a climate change is occurring and that we humans are a major cause of it. To repeat a talking point, 1.5 degrees Celsius have been reached more in the average climate in the past 6 decades. We know the definitions. Let's talk about how climate change affects biodiversity and vice versa. We talked about biodiversity and how it controls climate change. It's been a proven fact that the more biodiverse an ecosystem is, the more prone it is to resist climate change. Healthy ecosystems and rich biodiversity are fundamental to life on the planet. However, the climate change we're doing is affecting the habitats of several species, which must either adapt or migrate. The problem with migrating is that even if you find the temperature they're looking for, they have to adapt to different ways of finding food and different predators that might roam the area. Small changes in the average temperature can have a significant effect upon ecosystems. So a change of 1.5 degrees Celsius might seem really small, but when you take into account that this kind of change occurs once every century or so, it's an alarming fact. Species that keep balance on their ecosystems are starting to disappear at higher rates. Species like photosynthetic beings like plants and certain bacteria are disappearing at a bigger rate. Permafrost temperatures across everywhere have increased, which leads to hypothesis that maybe a primitive bacteria, prehistoric bacteria or virus may emerge, causing us to have even a bigger impact on our health. Each decade, sea ice is shrinking more and more, and the Arctic is warming twice as fast as the South. This being because the Arctic is kind of a big chunk of ice, while the south is a continent with a lot of snow on top of it. Too much CO2 in our environment is absorbed into the water, making it difficult for some species to build shells and skeletal structures, like coral reefs we already mentioned. These species are expert in turning the CO2 into oxygen, but since they are receiving an extreme amount of CO2, they do not have the ability to process all that. Many of the different species of plants and animals are either dying out or trying to move to more different temperatures. Some succeed in the attempt and some others don't, which is causing the big biodiversity loss that we talked about in slide number 2. These are some extra resources you can check for yourself, and I recommend for you to do your own research on these topics so you can be on top of it and cover anything that this seminar might have or might have not covered. Thank you for your attention.